Welcome to the bada video lecture. In this lecture, I'll explain the web namespace. The OSP web namespace provides classes and interfaces for integrating web browsing and JavaScript features into applications. This namespace has two sub-namespaces, Web Controls and Web JSON. With the Web Controls namespace, you can embed the native web browser inside your application. And parsing and composing JavaScript object notification, JSON, data can be done with the Web JSON namespace. In this lecture, I'll be covering the user interface controls, components, provided to embed browser functionalities in your application, along with some example code snippet. Then, I'm going to explain JSON, JavaScript object notation, script parsing, and composing. The common behavior for accessing hyperlinks or other online content is to open them in the device's native browser that's launched as a separate application with the browser app control. But launching an external web browser might take the focus away from the original application and can become an unnecessary distraction, especially if the browser is only needed for a limited task. In many cases, it's more convenient to integrate the web browsing features directly into your application. In bada, you have the Web Controls namespace that contains classes and interfaces, which allows you to perform web-based operations. Now, let's see what the Web Control offers. The Web Control is an embedded web browser UI control. It can be used along with other UI controls over a form. It requires the web_service privilege to be added in your application's manifest.xml. The web control provides the functionality of loading a web page and listening to any events, notifications, and authentication requests that occur during a loading operation. If no actions are defined for handling them, the browser engine defaults to its own actions. It allows you to retrieve the back and forward lists and the entire web navigation history. It also allows you to search in a web page, as well as the web control provides you with a way to interact with JavaScript. The functionalities discussed in the previous page are provided mainly by the web class. This class provides the methods for embedding a browser in your application to load and render various types of web content. The web content can be added to the application by adding a web control, similar to adding UI controls. The web class has the Load URL API, which loads the resource specified by the URL. You can navigate through the web pages using the Go Forward and Go Back APIs. If you want to search for a particular word on the current page, you can use the Search Text API. Also, with the web class, you can execute JavaScript code from a C++ object by calling the Web Evaluate JavaScript N method. There are some more APIs to enable block selection and privacy settings, which we'll discuss in the coming slides. Now, let's talk about some of the listeners which are associated with page loading and downloading web data. First, let's check the loading listener. This interface allows you to listen to any events, notifications, and authentication requests that occur during a loading operation. If no actions are defined for handling them, the browser engine defaults to its own actions. We can get notifications regarding the progress percentage and when the loading is started, finished, or canceled. When a title is received, we'll get the on-page title received event. Similarly, data received is also notified with an event. Errors are also intimated to the application through events. This listener notifies us when authentications are requested and canceled. When we download something, as soon as the first chunk of data is received, on web data received of the iLoading listener is fired with the MIME type. In the next slide, we'll see how to download the data. iWeb Download Listener is an interface used for downloading data to an application. An application can receive content from a network incrementally when it decides to download the content after checking the MIME. It's useful when the content is not supported by the framework itself and the application wants to handle it. As soon as the first chunk of data is received, on web data received of the iLoading listener is fired with the MIME type. If you want to download the data, return web_decision_download. Then the data is routed to on web chunked data received of the iWeb download listener. On web chunked data received reports when the HTTP protocol receives the next chunked data. On web data download completed reports when the content download is completed. If any error occurs while downloading content, it will be notified by on web download failed. After the web page is loaded, you can retrieve information such as the tag name, attributes, character data, images, and URLs about the HTML elements that have been clicked on the loaded web page using the Web Controls Hit Element Result class. You need to implement the OSP UI iTouch Event Listener for receiving touch events. You can use the Get Element by point N to get information about the element pointed to by the specified coordinates. To get the value of a specified attribute, you can use Get Attribute Value. OSP Web Controls Web provides you with a text selection feature on your web page. Using this feature, you can select and release a section of a text block from your web page, thus enabling you to copy and paste it. Set Block Selection Position enables you to set the starting point of the selection block, and you can extend the block by dragging the edge point of the block. This sets the selection block around the nearest word bound. To listen to changes of the selection block range, you need to add iWeb UI Event Listener to the web control and implement its methods. Using on web page block selected, you can handle the block selection event in your application. On web page block selected provides you with the start and endpoints of the selection block. While developing your web application, it might be important for you to ensure the privacy of your users. You may want to restrict the web control from storing the browsing information, such as the cache, cookie, or authentication information. You can enable private browsing in your application by passing true as the input argument to the Set Private Browsing Enabled API. You can also check whether private browsing is enabled or not by using the Is Private Browsing Enabled API. There are two interaction methods that you can have with JavaScript. Using the web Evaluate JavaScript N method, you can execute the JavaScript code from the bada C++ object. We'll look at a sample later in the presentation. The other kind of interaction is to use the JavaScript bridge interface to send data or a command to a bada C++ object from JavaScript. To accomplish this, you need to implement the iJavaScript bridge interface and add the JavaScript bridge to the web control. The iJavaScript bridge interface has two APIs, handle JavaScript request n and getName. The handle JavaScript request n API is invoked when the JavaScript request to native method exported by the JavaScript Bridge plugin is called. The getName API returns the name of this iJavaScript Bridge interface to identify each iJavaScript Bridge interface added in the web control. I'll introduce sample code that demonstrates the application of the JavaScript Bridge in later slides. Now, I'll present you with an example of creating and using a web control. Here, we're creating a form which will contain a web browser inside. To achieve this, our class is inherited from the form control class. Then, we declare a constructor and destructor. Here, I've declared a separate protected function to load the URL for readability. Then, a private pointer to the web control is declared to hold the web control across the application. Later, we'll use this onInitializing function to create and initialize our web control object. Here's our implementation of the onInitializing function. First, let's create and initialize the web control object. Then, add the control to the form. As discussed, I've created my own loadURL function, which I'm calling to load the URL. Now, let's check my loadURL function. Here, I've populated the URL and called the loadURL method of the web control to load the URL and start displaying the web content. Now let's peruse a sample code snippet to interact with JavaScript. We'll use the evaluate JavaScript n method to interact with JavaScript. Here, we can see some JavaScript code from the file map.html that sets some properties for the Google Map. For example, the zoom level is set to 8. Then, inside the loadURL method, we load this web page. Next, we're using the evaluate JavaScript n method to alter the zoom parameter value from 8 to 10. As you can see, the parameter of the evaluate JavaScript n method is the JavaScript code as a string. I discussed the JavaScript bridge earlier to send data or a command to a bada C++ object from JavaScript. Here, I'll show you a sample JavaScript bridge HTML file. You include the JavaScript Bridge plugin using this piece of code. Using the request to native JavaScript Bridge plugin exported method, you deliver data to the instance of the iJava script bridge interface. The method parameters are in the JSON key, value pair format. Here, my JS bridge is an instance of the iJava script bridge interface, and hello is the value for key data. On clicking the button, you invoke the function hello, which subsequently transfers data to the bada C++ object. In the next slide, you'll see how the data is retrieved by the bada C++ object. When request to native is called, the handle Java script request n method is invoked asynchronously. I have typecast the input argument to the JSON object so that we can retrieve the values. Since we want to retrieve the data value, I have set the key as data. Then, using the getValue method of the JSON object, I've retrieved the value associated with the data key and converted that to a string value. This applog will print hello as this was the data sent from the JavaScript. Now, let's have a look at the other available classes in the web namespace. Web setting holds the settings for a web control. You can, for example, enable or disable JavaScript and the image auto-loading option using this class. Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP, authentication requests are handled by the Authentication Challenge class. Using the method process, you can send the user ID and password to the server requesting user authentication. The Page Navigation List class provides the back and forward lists for a web control. In this section, you'll learn about parsing and composing JSON data. The web JSON namespace provides classes to parse and generate JavaScript object notation, JSON encoded data. These classes represent the basic JSON data types, such as objects, arrays, integers, strings, bools, and null. JSON encoded data is an unordered collection of key value pairs, and you can use the methods provided by the web JSON classes to manipulate them. The JSON feature is newly introduced to bada from bada version 2.0. JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation, is a lightweight data interchange format. It's used as an alternative to XML data. JSON is a simple, easy to read and write format. It's based on two data structures, object and array. An object is a collection of name-value pairs, and an array is an ordered list. An object begins with an open brace and ends with an end brace. Each name-value pair is separated by a comma. An array begins with an open square bracket and ends with a closed square bracket. Now, let's try to understand a sample JSON representation of an object that describes a person entity. A person has name and age keys with values such as John and 21. The address key is a composite key with street, city, and postal code keys that have values 21 2nd Street, New York, and 10021, respectively. The phone number key is an ordered list of phone type and number keys. The classes of the JSON namespace provide support for serialization and deserialization of JSON data. The compose method of JSON Writer is used to serialize JSON encoded data from the JSON value to a buffer. And to parse the JSON data, the parse_n method of the JSON parser class can be used. Both these classes will be discussed in a bit more detail later on. In addition to the writer and parser classes, the JSON namespace also has some other classes for manipulating basic JSON data types, such as objects, arrays, integers, strings, bools, and null. The JSON parser class provides three variants of parse functions based on JSON content available as a file in or in memory to parse JSON content. These two methods are used to parse in-memory JSON content, and this method is used to parse JSON content available as file. Now, let's go through an example to parse a JSON item. The steps involved are create and initialize the file and buffer object. Then, read the file content into the buffer. Call parse_n of the JSON parser and traverse the nodes to retrieve the data. As we've seen in the case of the parser, the JSON Writer class provides three variants of the method to generate or compose JSON data, depending on whether the output data is to be stored as a plain text file or in memory. These two methods are used to store output data in memory, and this method is used to store output data in a file. Now, let me present you with an example of writing JSON text to a file or in memory. First, I've created two keys, key 1 and key 2. Then, two JSON value strings, value 1 and value 2, were created. Thereafter, I created a new JSON object and initialized it. Then, I added a JSON key value pair to the JSON object. I've created a file, JSON compose sample.json, to which I'll write the JSON object contents. Using the compose method for a file, I write the JSON objects into the file. Then, to show you the usage, I've written the JSON object to a character buffer. And here, I'm writing the JSON object to byte buffer. Finally, when everything's done, don't forget to remove the used variables. We've learned about the web control to embed a browser in an application. We've also learned how to use the web controls to navigate web pages, download data, and interact with JavaScript. We have also learned about the JSON parser and writer web classes to parse and generate JSON encoded data. In the next slides, I have one scenario each for web control and JSON. You need to develop an application based on the details provided.